Winter was freezing, the houses were cold, but those humble meals rising from the kitchens warmed the heart of a nation. Throughout Britain's long history, winter was never just a season, it was a trial by fire, or rather by frost. Sometimes it came hand in hand with war, sometimes with economic collapse, and often with the bleakness of industrial cities. In damp, drafty houses where chimneys barely held back the chill, the most valuable refuge was the kitchen. Because no matter how harsh the outside world was, what simmered inside could offer both warmth and hope. That is why Britain's winter food is more than a set of recipes. It's a story of endurance and resilience. But here's the surprising part. These dishes were never only about feeding the stomach. They were about survival, comfort, and unity. A mother trying to keep her children warm, a family holding on to dignity in poverty, or a working man returning from the factory to find strength in a steaming bowl. These meals became symbols of persistence. Let's travel back to those winters when the steam from the pot was enough to soften even the hardest nights. 1. Scotch Broth, Scotland's hearty soup. Scotland's unforgiving climate shaped its people into masters of resourceful cooking. Scotch broth was one of the most trusted dishes of the 18th and 19th centuries, especially among poor farmers and workers. Built on barley, lamb bones, or mutton, and bulked up with root vegetables like carrots, swedes, turnips, and potatoes. It was simmered for hours until it became a thick, sustaining broth. On stormy Scottish nights, when the wind howled outside, the bubbling of Scotch broth in the pot drew the family close. It was more than a meal, it was a kind of social glue. One pot could last days, stretched and reheated, feeding multiple generations under the same roof. But wait, here's what makes it extraordinary. The flavor wasn't its greatest gift. It was the act of sharing. Everyone ladling from the same pot found a little warmth in both body and spirit. Today, Scotch broth is still served in restaurants, but its truest taste lives on in the memories of fogged-up windows and the crowded kitchens of old. 2. Cottage Pie, hope beneath mashed potatoes. When potatoes became widespread in Britain in the late 18th century, they changed the way poor families ate. Out of necessity came cottage pie. Leftover beef was minced, mixed with vegetables, and hidden beneath a thick layer of mashed potatoes before being baked to a golden crust. When that pie came out of the oven, the scent filling the home wasn't just an announcement that food was ready, it was reassurance. A guarantee that despite poverty, there was still pride in serving a hearty, filling dish. It was cheap, practical, and stretched far enough to last a few meals, but the shocking part is what the name reveals. Cottage referred to the modest homes of peasants, marking this dish as a working-class emblem. While the wealthy feasted on lavish roasts, laborers found dignity in a pie that turned scraps into sustenance. On bitter winter nights, cottage pie didn't just feed families, it gave them hope, wrapped in potato. 3. Shepherd's Pie. From the fields to the hearth close kin to cottage pie, shepherd's pie used lamb instead of beef, reflecting the sheep farming traditions of Wales and northern England. Chopped lamb, carrots, onions, and peas were cooked into a savory base, then blanketed with mashed potatoes and baked until bubbling. For 19th century farmers, shepherd's pie was more than dinner. It was reassurance after a long day in freezing fields. A father returning home to that pie by the hearth knew he had the strength to face tomorrow. For children, cracking through the golden potato crust became a ritual of comfort. You won't believe it, but this dish endured, even during wartime rationing. In World War II, when meat was scarce, families stretched whatever lamb scraps they had into a pie that could still fill everyone. It wasn't just food, it was proof that even in Britain's darkest winters, there was resilience on every plate. 4. Oxtail stew, richness from bones. In 19th century London, oxtail was considered one of the least valuable cuts, sold cheap or even discarded by butchers. But for the poor, it became the foundation of a miracle. Oxtail stew. Slow cooked for hours, the bones released gelatin, transforming the stew into something thick, silky, and deeply satisfying. On icy nights in cramped worker housing, lifting the lid on an oxtail stew was like letting warmth flood the room. Paired with a hunk of bread, It kept laborers full for an entire day. What seemed worthless at the butcher's block became priceless in the pot. And here's the thing, it wasn't just a recipe, it was a philosophy. Nothing was wasted. Every part had value. In a culture where survival often depended on making do, oxtail stew became the perfect symbol of thrift and creativity. Today it graces high-end restaurants, but its soul will always belong to those foggy, coal-stained kitchens of Victorian Britain. These 4 dishes weren't just meals, they were survival strategies, cultural symbols and shared comforts during Britain's coldest seasons. They didn't simply warm the body, they warmed the spirit of a nation. During Britain's harshest winters, people didn't just rely on heavy coats or coal stoves, they also relied on the ingenuity of their kitchens. The dishes from Part 1 gave warmth and nourishment, but the story of survival through food is far from finished. Now we travel to different corners of Britain, from the industrial northeast of England to the valleys of Wales, from the windswept Scottish Highlands to crowded worker neighborhoods. Each region contributed its own humble heroes of the winter table, but don't miss this detail. While today these recipes might seem like nostalgic curiosities, for generations they were lifelines that kept entire families alive. 5. Steak and kidney pudding, strength and steam. One of England's most iconic winter dishes, steak and kidney pudding took hold in the 19th century as a staple of the working-class table. Chunks of beef, kidney, onions, and sometimes mushrooms were sealed inside a sweet crust, a dense dough made from animal fat and steamed for hours until tender. In the depth of winter, kitchens filled with the mist of steam became the warmest place in the house. The slow, steady cooking filled the air with rich aroma, turning even the gloomiest day into a reason to gather. The steaming method ensured the pudding stayed moist, hearty, and filling, even in drafty, freezing homes. But here's the striking part. This dish wasn't just food. It was patience served on a plate. Families had to wait hours for it to be ready, mirroring the endurance needed to outlast the long winter months. For laborers trudging home after grueling shifts, steak and kidney pudding was proof that even after hardship, life still had flavor. 6. Peas pudding, the quiet strength of peas. If you visit Northeast England, you'll still hear the old rhyme, peas pudding hot, peas pudding cold. It's more than a children's chant. It's a reflection of history. Peas pudding, whether eaten warm or cold, has been a foundation of winter survival for centuries. Made by boiling split peas into a thick paste, often enriched with scraps of ham or bacon, it was cheap, easy to store, and endlessly filling. Families spread it on bread, paired it with meat, or ate it as a side dish. For the poor, it was not just a food, it was reassurance that no one would go to bed hungry. But here's the fascinating twist. Even though it was considered a side dish, peas pudding became a cultural symbol in its own right. For children in working-class towns, a slice of bread smeared with peas pudding after school wasn't just a snack. It was a moment of comfort, a taste of security in uncertain times. Even today, in the Northeast, it carries that same warmth of memory. 7. Cawl, Wales's warming stew of identity. In Wales, the heart of winter cooking is cawl, a dish that has been mentioned in written records as far back as the 14th century. Traditionally made with lamb or beef, carrots, swedes, potatoes, and leeks, it was simmered slowly until it became a thick, nourishing stew that could feed a whole household. The leek is a national symbol of Wales, and in cawl it takes center stage. Even during wartime shortages, when ingredients were scarce, families could gather enough potatoes and leeks from their fields to make a pot of cawl. Every spoonful carried not just warmth, but a sense of identity and pride. But here's the big reveal. Cawl wasn't only about feeding a family, it was about community. It was often cooked in large pots, shared with neighbors, and served at village gatherings. In this way, it strengthened social bonds just as much as it filled stomachs. In Welsh culture, cawl came to mean more than nourishment. It meant belonging. 8. Clapshot, Scotland's humble but heartfelt mash. Scotland's winter diet leaned heavily on root vegetables, and Clapshot shows why. A simple mix of mashed potatoes and turnips or swedes, flavored with butter, salt, and pepper. It was a staple side dish for centuries. In the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in rural areas, Clapshot was served alongside fish or meat. But in leaner times, it was made in such large portions that it could stand alone as the evening meal. Its steaming simplicity brought comfort to children and reassurance to parents struggling to stretch their food supplies. What makes it remarkable is its personal touch. Every household had its own way of making Clapshot, more potato in one home, more turnip in another, sometimes with an extra knob of butter, if fortunes allowed. This made the dish a source of quiet pride. Even in the humblest cottages, families could say, "This is ours." In the bitter cold of Scottish winters, Clapshot was more than a side dish. It was identity served on a plate, steak and kidney pudding with its patience, peas pudding with its simplicity, cawl with its sense of community, and Clapshot with its humble pride, all stood as shields against the biting cold of winter. Together, they made homes warmer, not just with heat, but with memory, tradition, and love. We've reached the final chapter of our journey through Britain's winter table. In the first two parts, we traveled from Scotland to northern England, from Welsh valleys to the cramped worker homes of London. Now we arrive at the last four dishes, recipes that became symbols of national identity, pride, and survival. Some were born from poverty, others grew into cultural icons, but all carried the same purpose: to keep people warm and together through the long, dark months. But don't miss this. These four dishes weren't just meals. They were cultural declarations, expressions of belonging and anchors of tradition during the harshest of winters. 9. Leek and potato soup, Wales's national bowl. For centuries, the leek has stood as one of Wales' proudest symbols. Leek and potato. Soup embodies that heritage in its simplest, most comforting form. With little more than potatoes, leeks, butter, and stock, families created a dish that was both hearty and affordable, especially throughout the 19th century among working-class households. The filling power of potatoes, paired with the sweet sharpness of leeks, created a soup that was not only nourishing, but symbolic. On winter evenings, the bubbling pot filled small Welsh homes with warmth and conversation, offering relief from the biting cold outside. But here's what makes it extraordinary. This recipe has survived nearly unchanged for generations. Even today, on St. David's Day, it is served proudly as part of national celebrations, a reminder that simple food can carry centuries of resilience and identity in a single bowl. 10. Haggis with neeps and tatties, Scotland's pride. Few dishes are as bound to a nation as haggis is to Scotland. Born from the principle that nothing should go to waste, it combined sheep offal with oats, spices, and fat, traditionally cooked in a sheep's stomach. Served alongside neeps and tatties, turnip and potato mash, it became one of the most sustaining meals of the Scottish winter. For laborers, haggis was strength. For children, it was comfort. For a nation, it was pride. It wasn't just about feeding the body, it was about declaring resilience in the face of scarcity. But wait, here's the best part. Haggis transcended the kitchen. On Burns Night, it was carried into dining rooms with poetry and ritual, celebrated as much for what it represented as for how it tasted. This dish didn't just warm stomachs, it lit the flame of Scottish cultural identity during the darkest months. 11. Welsh Rarebit. More than cheese on toast. The name might sound modest, just cheese on bread, but Welsh Rarebit is far richer than it seems. Known since the 18th century, it became one of the quickest and most beloved meals for long, cold nights, made with strong British cheeses, mustard, spices, and often a splash of ale. The thick sauce was poured over toasted bread and grilled until bubbling and golden. Crispy, tangy, and deeply satisfying, it was the definition of simple comfort. You won't believe it, but for many families, Welsh Rarebit wasn't just a snack, it was a savior. In lean times, when cheese supplies were dwindling, turning the last scraps into this flavorful dish meant no one went hungry. It proved that even with the humblest ingredients, families could create warmth, joy, and pride in their homes. 12. Stovies, Scotland's miracle of leftovers. Among the most practical Scottish dishes, Stovies is living proof of thrift turned into art. The name comes from to stove, meaning to stew slowly. Built from potatoes, onions, and whatever leftover meat or bones a family could find, it became a lifeline through many 19th and 20th century winters. In worker cottages, Stovies simmered quietly as families returned from long days. Sometimes it held lamb trimmings, sometimes beef scraps, sometimes only broth and vegetables, but it was always hearty, always filling, and always enough. Here's the detail that matters. Stovies wasn't just about eating, it was about refusing to waste. Every ingredient was valued, every scrap transformed into nourishment. To this day, Scottish families pass down their own versions of Stovies, serving it as soon as the first snow falls, a dish made from leftovers, yet filled with heritage. And with that, we complete the story of Britain's 12 winter dishes. Each one was more than food. They were survival strategies, cultural emblems, and memories carried from one generation to the next. They kept families warm not just with calories, but with pride, belonging, and tradition. Britain's winter nights were not remembered only for their cold and darkness. Thanks to these dishes, they were also remembered for the laughter, the togetherness, and the aromas rising from kitchens across the land.